Welcome to Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Christy Stickney is an expert in market-based development strategies centered on affordable housing, financial services, and water and sanitation. Her most recent work has included several publications on affordable housing and housing microfinance. Actively involved in microfinance since 1993, Christy directed Habitat for Humanity's housing finance programs in Latin America, where she pioneered initiatives to stimulate innovation and increased scale in housing microfinance. Christy also worked for Opportunity International, where she led product design and training in poverty-focused lending worldwide. I spoke with Christy in Costa Rica. Hi, Christy. Thank you so much for being on Terms of Reference with me today.
Thanks, Stephen.
Where are we calling you today?
I'm at my home office here in San Jose, Costa Rica.
Tell us, to start off with, what is it that you do as an independent consultant?
Yeah, I've been an independent consultant for about 3.5 years, and I'm really leveraging my 25 years of development work. I'd say that my focus is in what I'd call market-based development initiatives. Program strategies that leverage market forces to relieve poverty and increase access to valuable goods and services to the base of the pyramid, the low-income majority, the poor, however you want to call them. So in the past, my focus was in financial services, primarily microfinance, as it's often called, and in recent years, I focus quite a lot on housing.
So take me back to the first part of that. Most people are familiar with market-based activities, in fairly commercial-based stuff. Give me an example of a specific program you maybe worked on recently that leverages a market-based activity to help the poor.
Okay. A recent study that's been published that I wrote at the end of last year had to do with assessing business models for the private sector for serving poor populations, specifically in Latin America and the Caribbean, with housing solutions. It's a wide range of different kinds of housing solutions, everything from what would be called a complete housing solution that would involve a fully built new home on titled property within a development that has infrastructure, services, and the like, something like you and I might live in, but smaller and simpler, all the way to a very, very simple housing solution that could be as small as adding windows on a house, or a new roof, or a second story, or an additional room, which those are often referred to as home improvements. So those are the different ranges of solutions. Mm-hmm. And in this study, we were looking at private sector approaches to bringing those kinds of services sustainably in a way that could be both financially viable, a profitable business venture, as well as having social impact.
And the difference there would be, rather than government assistance where it would be granted to the individual or the community, where it's the individuals are actually purchasing the service through some means.
That's right. They're purchasing. In fact, the financing piece is critical in this. In every single one of these models, the financing piece was very innovative. And what they would do is turn basically market gaps or failures into business opportunities by addressing those market failures with a strategy or a product that was particularly designed for a specific target group. They could create a unique product that no one else is offering really on the market. The challenge in this case is, and in most of these kinds of endeavors, is to create enough of a volume to make the business profitable, because the margins tend to be smaller when you're working with the base of the pyramid or the low income groups.
And so you said you worked on this study. What's your role in it? Are you collecting primary data? Are you doing background research? Or are you doing a bit of everything?
Yeah, in this case, I was working off of secondary data and also conducting interviews with the different institutions that were implementing these programs. Granted, many of them are quite new and they're just launching. So we were looking at the models really from a conceptual framework. Others had a certain amount of experience, but many of them are quite new. And so we were comparing the different approaches and what groups they were reaching and what types of institutions were involved. In many cases, they have to work in partnership with other private sector actors and also with governments, government subsidy programs or municipal government programs of different natures.
Is there a particular private sector entity, without necessarily naming names or brands or anything, that you have found are more receptive to this type of work, or are you finding that commercial activities are really looking for new markets and are hungry for this kind of opportunity?
That's a good question, Stephen. My general sense is these institutions have some type of a social focus built into their fabric.
So this would be part of their CSR work or something?
Well, no more. These are institutions that may have been created with a double bottom line in mind from the start, that they have a social focus and also the intention of being very business driven.
We're not talking about Home Depot here.
Not really. Cemex in Mexico is one of the partners, one of the institutions studied in this recent report. Cemex has a branch or a specific department within them called Patrimonio Hoy. They've received a lot of attention, and yet it's been difficult for this program that's very much focused on the lower income populations or clients to grow as quickly as they would like, because they're competing with internal resources.
And Cemex is a huge organization. I mean, they're global.
Yes, they are huge. And they're huge. And they're trying to make this program regional. So part of their intention is to then carry this Patrimonio Hoy program into new markets such as Colombia and Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic. It's a challenge. It's a challenge within a corporation that is, so large and so commercially driven.
That was sort of where I was going to ask. Did you come to them with the study, or is this something that they provided funds for?
No, this study was funded by the Inter-American Development Bank. There's a group within the bank called Opportunities for the Majority, and they are specifically private sector driven and focused. They are acting as investors to these programs, trying to entice private sector involvement in serving this group. Housing is just one of their areas of focus. They have several others. So they wanted to really highlight some of the work they've been doing specifically in the housing space.
Speaking of that, I wanted to sort of move in a slightly different direction here, or channel where we're going right now. That I know that you worked for many years, I think it's like 9 years, for Habitat for Humanity, which obviously has a housing focus, and this particular project is housing driven as well. Do you find that most of your work, take me through that genesis, is a lot of your work now coming from that experience, or would you also be able to sort of contribute to a study on different lighting options or cleaner options? We hear a lot about bottom of the pyramid
green
types
technology.
of things. Exactly. Tell me about that.
Yes, I didn't really intend to move into housing, but I did assume a position at Habitat, as you said. It was about 12 years ago. And over time, obviously their focus is on housing. And through that, I found a wonderful opportunity to merge my background in finance, and specifically microfinance, with the housing issues that are relevant in developing countries. Truthfully, one of the interesting discoveries that I was unaware of is that the poor do not generally purchase a home. The mortgage markets, traditional mortgage markets, are not available to low income, even to many middle income. And so the ability to finance housing is of limited access to most people.
And is this, I'm forgetting the extremely famous individual's name about land rights and land ownership. Is that tied to that as well?
Hernando Soto.
Yeah, there you go. Hernando Soto, thanks.
Yes, land is a huge factor as well. Interestingly, most of the poor own their homes they have self-declared home ownership rates that are very high. Latin America is one of the highest. It's over 70%. So the housing issues have less to do with what's called a quantitative deficit. It's not that most people are homeless, but rather the homes they have are substandard, and they need assistance in improving those homes and making them more livable. That's why something like what we were ultimately working with in Habitat were initiatives to promote what's referred to as housing microfinance. As I was saying before, it's kind of a merging of the housing realities of the poor and the principles of microfinance that are, financial measures or products and services that are tailored to the financial realities of low-income sector. So these are financial products that really finance small incremental improvements as opposed to the outright purchase of a new home. The poor generally tend to improve their homes or build their homes, even acquire homes, in a long process of small incremental stages. And so by tailoring financing to match these short but repeated stages of improvement, the microfinance sector has been able to create a product that's really well tailored to their housing needs and realities as well as their financial situation.
By whose standard are we measuring adequate housing? It would seem that there would be cultural context, there would be socioeconomic context. Is that a part of your work as well, or what is the baseline that you measure adequate housing against?
Well, the ultimate authority on adequate housing is probably the UN Habitat Group, the United Nations section that is focused on housing. And they have a declaration of what are the specific indicators regarding adequate housing. It even takes into account features such as water and sanitation and basic infrastructure. But by moving into this arena of market-based initiatives, we're putting that definition of adequate housing and even the prioritization of home improvements into the hands of the homeowners. Mm-hmm. And it's allowing them to determine what are the steps that are most important to me, that I'm even willing to finance these and pay for these. And so then they determine, is it more important for me to build an extra room for my growing family? Or is it to seal the leaking roof?
Right.
And so it's really up to them to make those decisions. So.
Fascinating work. I'd like to talk to you more about how you got into this work. You said 25 years of development work at this stage. Well, I want to sort of go backwards and forwards. What was the decision that took you to the place where you're like, I'm ready to make the leap and move from sort of traditional career-oriented to the independent consultant world?
Well, that was a huge decision. I would say, going to my background, I think I cheated a bit in that I was raised as a child of a development worker. My father worked in development when I was a kid, and I grew up overseas. So in a sense, I picked it up by osmosis, a certain level of understanding and appreciation for development work.
Let me feed on that really quick. Did you always know that this was kind of the work you were going to do?
No, not at all. I assumed, actually, coming as I was finalizing my college education and looking at the job market, I had actually assumed I would go into just private sector work and get a stable job and live a normal, American life. And I experienced what I would experience what I would call a premature midlife crisis, where I envisioned myself in that life actually doing pretty much the best I could imagine professionally and personally, and living that kind of a life and looking a couple, decades into the future, and suddenly had this overriding sense of, so what? Like, what? It suddenly wasn't compelling to me anymore. It lost, I don't know how, it just lost its meaning.
Was this
so I was left in a vacuum.
Yeah, was this while you were in university still? Or?
Yes, I was wrapping up my senior year and going through, the standard on-campus interviews, and it was in that process, and suddenly was left with basically no options. I had no idea what I would do if I wasn't going to go into just a standard profession. And so in some ways, I almost fell back on the idea of going into international development. As I said, having been raised in that, I knew I liked overseas work or traveling, so I looked into options such as the Peace Corps and others, and finally settled on a group called the Mennonite Central Committee. It's kind of a Christian Peace Corps. Took an assignment in Nicaragua, which was wonderful, and I've never looked back. That's just, it set my career in motion.
It was a great fit, and you knew you'd found home, basically.
Yes, and I've been fortunate. Even different steps along the way, I've just happened to find a wonderful new niche, such as microfinance. I kind of fell into when I went to grad school and started translating work for a group called Opportunity International, and that eventually evolved into a job. And similarly with Habitat. Well, Habitat was a position I actually found on the internet when I was looking for a job.
And so you followed this career, and at some point you said it was a struggle, or you made the tough decision to make the jump. Take us through that process. How did you finally? What was the deciding factor? And I guess first, what was the genesis of saying, "Hey, maybe it's time to be independent"? And then what was the factor that you finally said, "Yes, I'm going to do it"?
Yeah, that was one of the hardest decisions I've made in my life, because I love my work. It was very hard to step away from it, and really, that's what it felt like. The genesis of it was quite simply, I was pregnant with my second child, and realized I had this growing longing that I had been completely unaware of. It caught me totally by surprise, but a growing longing to spend more time with my little boys, the one who was coming as well as the one who was already in our home. And so my husband and I started looking at how could we handle this financially, and realized it would be a huge loss financially, but even more a loss in many ways that felt personally to leave basically a nice, stable position, even of leadership and within Habitat, to go independent with no security at all.
How did you approach that with your peers in your current position before you left? Did you consult them as well before making the decision, or was it purely you and your husband and your family?
I believe I didn't consult anyone within the organization. I kept it very, very personal and secret, or confidential at the time. But I really benefited from many female colleagues who'd gone before me, primarily in the microfinance field, not so much at Habitat, but when I was involved in microfinance, I had observed several professionals, women, who had children, as I did later in life, I would say, and they transitioned very successfully into consulting roles. And I had made a mental note of that, even though I wasn't married and definitely not looking at having kids at that time. But they were my role models, really. And I believed I could do the same, even though I wasn't sure how. It was a step of faith. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, within Habitat, I had contracted a lot of consultants, and that helped me envision my future business.
And so exactly. So you created the vision already you saw how it worked, you saw how business was won, those kinds of things.
I did. I have tracked consultants quite closely from personal motivation, a personal interest of seeing, could this be a reality at some point in my career? But truly the reason I did it was the desire to be near my kids during this time of my life. That was the motivation. And it's been wonderful. It hasn't always been easy.
Well, yeah, so let's talk about that. After you made the initial jump, what have been the biggest lessons that you've learned over the last 3 years initially, or, how have you refined your practice to suit you better?
Well, the first 2 years, I was very fortunate that there was enough work coming out of Habitat to keep me sufficiently engaged. I got just enough assignments, and those felt very comfortable. It was with people I knew, on assignments that I was quite familiar with, and it didn't take really any effort on my part to go out and market my skills. So that was really comfortable. But I hit a period at about year 3, this was last year, where Habitat's assignments started to dwindle a bit, and I also felt the need to branch out professionally. I needed to get to know some new organizations and do some different work from what I'd been doing all along. And that was hard. At the beginning, I was not getting many responses. One as a consultant, I find, really has to be able to embrace moments of silence. There's a lot of silence with no response or delayed responses, and not take those personally. It's easy to say, but it's something I feel I'm learning is to just get out there and keep looking. And eventually my networks of friends, colleagues, former colleagues produced, say, 2 new important clients that have really brought a lot of work this year. This year has been wonderful. I've had a nice flow of work from now 3 organizations, including Habitat. So it's paid off. It just took a long time to get there. What felt like a long time.
What are some of the strategies other than network that you've used to win new business or meet new clients or find new work?
It's really been through my contacts, through friends, former colleagues, that I've been able to both seek work through them or through their referrals. I haven't really gone on the open market, or what little I've tried to do by just sending my CV in response to an assignment has really not produced much of anything for me. It's been really working those networks. And I think one of the things is that as a consultant, I don't really market myself intentionally as an expert. I'm more of let's say a contract worker. When institutions have more work than they can do in a certain area, I can, bite off a little piece and take that on myself and help them, get beyond the hurdles they're facing or bottlenecks.
Yeah, and so part of your pitch to your network is, hey, do you have extra work that you need to offload, essentially?
That's been a large part of what I've done, let's say, at Habitat. They know me well, and it's easy for them to do that. Right now, one of the other organizations I'm working with, I do get that sense I'm just some reliable additional help in some very tangible areas. They rely heavily on another consultant for certain parts of the world, and I'm their go-to consultant for Latin America for certain assignments. But they are very operational. They're not producing glamorous reports or outside evaluations. They're very much related to their day-to-day operations. That's
interesting that you characterize operational as non-glamorous. Do you feel like there's that sense in the development world where if you're, sort of nuts and bolts on the ground, digging the well or delivering the service to the beneficiary, it's more like punching a clock, and maybe that's not the right term, and yet there's sexier work in moving the intellectual property ahead, producing evaluations, coming up with innovative ideas. Do you have that sense?
I do get that sense sometimes because the operational work is often not highly theoretical or intellectual. It's a lot of very, very small details that need to be dealt with, and documents that need to be written, manuals that need to be corrected, and trainings that need to happen. It's a lot of rolling up sleeves and just being willing to do rigorous work, but that work doesn't necessarily get the let's say the publicity that a report or an article would get. Yet in the end, frankly, I feel like it's a wonderful benefit that I have as a consultant, that I can actually have my fingers in operational work. That's pretty rare, I think, for consultants. And it allows me not only to be learning from the field, which is really my school. That's where I learn is from being on the ground and seeing things firsthand myself and living through those experiences. But it's also this great satisfaction of knowing the work I am doing has an immediate benefit. Whereas, as you well know, as a consultant, we often produce materials that sit on a shelf or on a hard drive and do not get a lot of practical use. So that for me is very, very rewarding.
I know that in the very near future here, you're going to be presenting this new work that we were discussing about earlier. Is that do you find that to be an important part of your work for you in particular? Some people find the analysis more satisfying. Some people find, the pure research more satisfying. Some people, look for different ways. Is the actual presentation and seeing it get used, is that really where you like to find satisfaction?
To be honest with you, I love all of that. I really enjoy being able to do the kind of higher level thinking, research, reflection, and the challenge of writing a really well-written document for me is all very, very satisfying. But I also enjoy the operational side. So for me, I really enjoy a mix of those things rather than just one or the other. I believe they both stretch me in different ways, personally and professionally. In some ways, the research is like they're paying me to learn, regardless if it's getting used or not. It's wonderful.
Back in the day, I used to joke with my colleagues that I get paid to come up with a new master's degree pretty much every quarter because of the work that we do.
Oh, totally. It is.
That's great.
It's rich.
Yeah. What do you prefer as your practice is growing? It sounds like you're having a great year. Things are on the move. Would you prefer to sort of have, that one solid client that you're working with at a time? Do you prefer to juggle multiple assignments? What's your preferred way to work?
I think ideally I'd like to have a small handful of long-term clients that can hand me projects at least once a year. That way I maintain an understanding of them as an organization. It takes a long time, I find, to really get to know an organization. And those relationships are renewed within their teams. And also that way I do less marketing.
Yeah, sure. If we could all get rid of the marketing, that would be the best thing, right?
It would be, yeah. So that would be my ideal scenario, is to really nurture a few relationships or a few institutions that could hand me if not a steady stream, at least a stream of work.
Have you found that the culture of the organization you're working for, you just said, it takes a while to get used to the organization, et cetera. Does that really impact the type of work you're doing, or at least the modality, those kinds of things?
So what do you mean when you're saying culture of the organization?
What I meant by modality and culture of organization is that, there's a clear distinction in the type of people you're working with in an advocacy organization as opposed to an operational organization, as opposed to, a startup versus, a huge conglomerate like Habitat. And have you found in your practice that your work is affected by different cultural contexts like that?
Definitely. A big part of my work is trying to understand not only how the institution works, what the institutional culture is, but what their priorities are for the project that I've been assigned to do. Because often what's stated in the terms of reference isn't exactly what they're wanting, let's say, or do you
have an example of that, like a real tangible example?
Yeah, I've been asked to write reports that sound basically like pretty standard evaluations, but clearly they're intended to be for PR purposes. And so it's good to know that, both in terms of designing the structure and content, but also how it's worded and what the design itself and how it's how the information is put forth. It'll vary a lot depending on what really the true motivation is for creating that document.
Do you find that as a consultant you are able to be flexible with the motivation of the client? I say that it's sort of a loaded question in that I've worked with plenty of people over the years who are, they not necessarily an agenda, but they have a very particular worldview about how a particular piece should be used or how evaluation should be used. Do you find that you have you're able to be flexible in that way, or has there ever been an assignment where you're like, I don't think I can do this?
That's an interesting question. For the most part, I've worked with people that I've known before or within institutional cultures that are similar enough to other organizations I've worked with that I can pretty much transfer a lot of my understanding to that setting. At times I have worked with difficult people. I would say it's more individuals that maybe have a certain intention that is not exactly aligned with how I would see the intention of that project or assignment. I try to be as upfront as possible about what I feel would be a more appropriate definition of the assignment, and then we see, can we reach an agreement on that? The more I can do that up front, I feel it's been really helpful, rather than having to wade through that once we've already done a lot of work.
What you've just described is something that I've talked with many people about is, development itself is a very process-oriented industry. And so this is a nuts and bolts question for you. How does that run into you bidding out your time? Are you very strict on saying, hey, this is going to be 10 days of time and, I've got 1 day for, inception and 2 days for writing and 3 days for research? Or are you more likely to say, here's a lump sum of what I think this will cost over the next 3 months, and you sort of play your time flexibly? Or how do you put your time together?
How do I price it?
Yeah.
It really depends on the customer. Some of them have a set fee for what they're willing to pay for an assignment, and I then budget my time and see, is this worth it for me? And then there are others that are willing to pay based on the actual time spent, which I love because it
Sure. Mm-hmm.
It covers me. So I'll do both of those. I've rarely had a case where I've had to undersell my time. And when I have, I usually go into the project knowing, okay, I'm going to be donating an extra day of my time to this project. But at the time, it seemed like either the project was worthwhile enough for potential future work, or it would position me or allow me to learn information that was valuable enough for me to make that contribution out of my own pocket.
And do you ever have the sense, and related to the question, the topic we were having earlier about finding the true motivation behind the assignment, I'm thinking in inverted commas, you sort of get what you pay for? Do you ever feel like you have that sense on a project?
Yes.
And let me couch that, without leading the interview anywhere. Yeah. But again, some of the assignments I've been involved with, or other people we've talked with here, where let's take evaluation as an example. You show up to the client and you've gone through a bidding process, or you've gone through a selling process, and you show up and it turns out the person you're working with, or the team you're working with, has a very different expectation for the level of effort than what was sort of discussed prior to. And then you sort of have that difficult conversation of, well, here's what you're kind of willing to pay for, and here's what you're asking. Do you ever have those difficult conversations?
I've only had that once, and I basically had to say, I've completed according to what we've agreed, and then I had to walk away from it. So I'm not willing to do any more on this. That was a very specific project. I've also had another one where additional work was requested, but in each case, I felt it was to my benefit as well to attend to their requests for numerous reasons. Again, because I felt that I was building a relationship with them that would be beneficial in the future. And also, I want that final product. It has my name on it. I want that to be as good as it can be. So in some ways, they're helping me as well. And so I felt that was very much worth my investment. And so
it sounds like quite often you're finding intangible compensation from the work that you're doing, either through learning or through growth or through connections or whatever.
It tends to all build on itself somehow or another. Not every single project does that, but to a large extent, there's enough overlap in these development fields and networks that one can see benefits from those kinds of investments quite easily. I find it to be pretty worthwhile. The good thing is also I'm not selling anyone else's time. I'm only selling my own time. I'm independent. I don't have a company and employees that I'm contracting and have to pay. So it's only my decision if I'm going to be spending extra time. And I see, I spend so little time really in marketing. It ends up being less than 10% of my overall work time. So those investments to me are also part of my marketing.
Interesting. Has there ever been a time when you felt like or you've been told that you've failed, that you either fell down on the job or didn't deliver what your client was expected? And if so, how did you recover from that?
Yes, there's one assignment that I was mentioning that I just kind of had to draw a line and walk away from. I realized that the person who contracted me didn't feel like I had turned in what was expected of her. And I tried many times, it's a her now. I've tried many times throughout the life of the project to define what those deliverables were. And unfortunately, I went into this assignment without having those as clear as they should have been. And so in the end, I obviously didn't deliver them. So I felt badly about that. But on the other hand, I also realized it probably wasn't, let's say, an area where I was going to continue to seek future work anyway. To put it that way.
Sure.
Cut your losses.
Absolutely. Speaking of tracking your losses, you're independent now. You've been out there 3 years. How do you handle the administration of your individual practice? And what I mean by this is, you said you've got marketing, you've got delivery, and then you actually have to, you've got taxes to file, you've got invoices to make sure they're fulfilled. Is there any special sauce that you've found to get that done, or have you had any trouble with that you've figured out a trick to?
I think what works to my advantage, besides the fact that I'm only selling my own services, is that my intention is not to work full-time right now. Otherwise, I defeat the whole purpose of having gone into consulting, which was to be able to spend more time with my family and specifically my 2 kids. So as a result, I do have my time is fungible. I can move things around. If I need a little more time to submit an extra report or something else, I can actually usually find that time. My main goal, in addition to having a financial goal that I need to meet in terms of income I bring in for our family, and also wanting to stay connected in terms of my career, my other goal is to not become overcommitted. I do not want my work to be stressful. That's very important to me. And so my worst moments are when I realize somehow I've overcommitted and I can't meet a deadline or I have too many conflicting appointments. My goal really is to avoid that scenario. And so in the end,
I think you've just described the antithesis of every development or aid worker that I've met. What's the strategy for making, other than guarding your time religiously, what's another strategy for making sure that you never wake up and say, this is overwhelming, I'm stressed, this is not where I wanted to be?
Well, one is being really honest with the people I'm contracting with in terms of my timing and availability. I've had, obviously, to turn down assignments because of that, or they've turned me down because of that. The other is I'm not going out and chasing every opportunity out there. I'm being quite selective and just focusing on really nurturing a few relationships and hoping that brings a steady stream of work and letting each of them know clearly, the month of July, I'm off. You can't count on me then. And trying to stay ahead of the game and getting those messages out. I just don't have, during this period of my life, the same level of ambition as I had when I was fully involved in the career. And I don't want my consulting to be driven by ambition. I want this to be a way to stay engaged and to earn some money and to feel useful.
What's the most difficult part about your consulting practice that you need to negotiate with your family commitments that they're clearly top priority for you? Is it travel? Is it finance? Is it some other topic that you find you really sort of always have to be in negotiation or navigate?
Travel is definitely a challenge. It's very common for assignments to require quite a bit of travel. I've been very fortunate when I've found certain assignments that have not required any. I love those. But truthfully, I need to travel some just to stay in touch as well. So a certain level of travel is a requirement. And just being able to manage those. Frankly, I think my family does just fine without me. My husband's very capable of managing the house without me. It's more myself. I miss being at home during this time of my kids' lives. So that's definitely something I have to balance. And I also don't want my days to be filled with work. In fact, I often have to make sure I spend enough time working when I'm home and not traveling, because there are a lot of other demands as well, and temptations.
Is there a way that you, again, another strategy that you found maybe to do that? Is it locking yourself in an office? Is it leaving the house? Is it?
Oh, one of them is I come up to my folks' home. They only live here half the year. So the half of the year they're not here, this becomes my office. This is where I am right now. Working from home is a bit more challenging when I hear the kids yelling in the background or something. So that's definitely one strategy. I tend to spend mornings working. I find that's an easier time. Kids are often at school or engaged in some productive activity, whereas afternoons tend to be more flexible.
2 more questions. Is there a particular piece of technology and it could be any kind of technology, not necessarily information technology, but I don't know, any type of tool that you have found to be just your go-to resource for either working with your clients or absolutely necessary for you to be successful as a consultant?
That's interesting. I would just say my laptop. Yeah. My laptop is my tool. It's my brain. It's those are my files. It's everything. It's all my contacts. I was recently on a trip in Guatemala, and it was the last evening before I was packing up to get a early morning flight back home. And I realized I'd left my power cord at the office where I'd been working, and there was absolutely no way to get it before we left. And I just suddenly realized how utterly dependent I am on this machine. I can't turn it on after the battery's depleted. I don't have a power cord. And so it really, without the laptop, that would be it. I don't really use any new fancy technologies for my work.
So it's pretty much Microsoft Office or a web browser and you're good.
Yeah, I also have to say I use the internet constantly for research.
Sure, of course. If we were sitting somewhere having a beer right now or a cup of coffee, whichever you prefer, and you were, going to go back in your brain and over the last 25 years, pick your go-to story for development work or whatever. What's the go-to story that you tell everybody, either about a wonderful time, an epiphany, a horrible time, a challenge that you came through? What's that story that you tell everyone?
Yeah, the stories really have to do more with, I guess, what I encounter when I'm visiting with beneficiaries or clients, however you want to call them. A good story, an encouraging story, really more perhaps of an insightful story, was back in the 90s when I was working in microfinance. I remember visiting an older woman in Barranquilla, Colombia, a coastal city of Colombia, and she had borrowed several microfinance loans, at least 3 of them. And this was the first time I had a chance to visit her. Her home was very, very simple, dirt floor, 1 or 2 rooms. And I was surprised to see she had a candy making business. They're kind of these very typical candies that are made over a big pot and an open fire on the floor of her house or hut, basically. And I could see really nothing that had grown because of these loans, this financing. She had such simple equipment, and she was only producing what she could sell herself. So I had this big question of really what benefit are these loans making for her? Or are we just basically financing her standard activity with a pretty significant interest rate or cost to her? And when I asked her very specifically, how have these loans benefited you? She led me to a room, the room next door, where she had stockpiled a small collection of concrete blocks. And she explained she was going to use that to build another room onto her shack. And so it showed me how loans, specifically, microfinance interventions, can have impacts that spread out so far beyond the realm of what we see. I mean, she was going to actually improve her home with the outcomes of her loan. She really wasn't intending to grow her business as much as benefit her household. And this was years before I even started working in the whole housing arena in a more direct way. But that was an encouraging sign to me. It was just a kind of educational moment of realizing that truly finance, microfinance, can have impact well beyond the realm of business itself.
Final question. You have been in this business a long time. You have graduated to, what some consider the holy grail of being an independent consultant successfully. But development work is very particular work. And there are lots and lots of people out there getting master's degrees or even considering career changes to come into this business. What is the sage piece of advice that you give to the younger generations or, people considering making career changes about how to either enter or be successful in this business? What's your truth?
Yeah, I'm sure I'm not the only one to say this, but I've pretty much said it for the last couple decades. For people who've asked that question, I say you need field experience. You need to get out there. You need to spend 2 to 3 years minimum rolling up your sleeves and interacting with the poor and working in efforts directly that try to help them in whatever way that is.
So be operational first.
Yes, and encounter that reality, because I really feel that the reality of the developing world, especially when you're trying to battle issues related to poverty, it's often contrary, even counterintuitive to the logic that operates in the North. And the only way to really understand that in a deep and even a personal way is having experienced it. That really is my field. I see a lot of people coming into development straight out of, private sector work. And I have doubts about that. Yeah, we can do a lot of harm. And I think it's not only a way to understand in a much more personal and direct way what the reality is like, but also we need to be humbled. I think we enter with a lot higher expectations of ourselves and what we can accomplish. It helps to ground us.
Christy, thanks so much for your time today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Stephen.
You've been listening to Terms of Reference, a weekly podcast from aidpreneur.com. Find us on iTunes or at www.aidpreneur.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.